Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. This week, we're discussing if the petrodollar system will be replaced by China-led CBDCs. In the last few weeks, there's been a flurry of reports, Brunello, that announced that Saudi Arabia had quietly let one of its 50-year petrodollar agreement with the US lapse. This sort of created a lot of rumors about the future of this economic cooperation. But fill us in with a bit more detail there. What's going on here?
Yeah, we had lots of reports suggesting that there was this 50-year deal between Saudi Arabia and the US, the basis of the petrodollar system that Saudi Arabia not renewed, and therefore this will mark the end of the petrodollar system. And all this has happened secretly and quietly, and for some reason, the major media around the world have not reported this news that in theory is groundbreaking and so on and so forth. The reality is slightly different from this. There's some element of it, but it needs to be analyzed bit by bit. So first and foremost, let's discuss how we got there. So in 1971, war in Vietnam was causing the US to spend incredible amount of money, which they didn't have, so they had to print. Printing this money meant, at the time in which the Bretton Woods system was still in place, effectively fixed exchange rate, meant that at some point, some countries started to ask the US to convert their dollars into gold, as the system was so. And first and foremost, France. That became impossible, because if the US had to convert in gold all the dollars that were around the world, they would run out of the gold reserve. So Richard Nixon, the president of the US at the time, said, you know what, sorry guys, it's the end of it. So he broke the system, and 2 years later, effectively, all the major currencies were floating. We are in 1973. Guess what? We have the oil shock. The oil shock that meant a fourfold increase in oil prices by Saudi Arabia and the OPEC countries, and an embargo on oil production for the US and others. So big problem that was on top of the previous problem of the breakup of the monetary system as we knew it at the time. So the US sent his best diplomat, effectively, Kissinger, that died a few months ago. We remember him in one of our podcasts, to negotiate a deal with the Saudis, because the Saudis had the opposite problems. They were selling lots of oil at the much higher prices, that they had lots of reserves coming in. What to do with them, and how to ensure that these revenues were constant over time. So effectively, the Saudis decided to peg the real to the dollar, and to recycle this money, hence dubbed petrodollar, recycle the oil revenues from the sales of oil into the US Treasury market. This happened via two major deals. One was, in fact, signed on the 8th of June, 74. And this is the one that people say has not been renewed and so on. Well, if you look at the deal, and actually we report in our link on our website the exact terms of these reports, there's nothing along those lines. Yes, the US Congress says that agreement was meant to foster, and I read, closer political ties between the two countries through economic cooperation, assist Saudi Arabia industrialization and development while recycling petrodollars. So the idea was that lots of things had to happen, financial assistance and industrial assistance for Saudi Arabia to develop while recycling petrodollar. The second agreement was in fact a secret one, and this was the real secret one, and was signed later on in 74. before, and that was effectively a promise by the US to guarantee um, military assistance and security to Saudi Arabia in exchange for um, um, uh, making the transactions of oil in dollars and invest them in US treasury market, which effectively also meant, and we see is still valid today, that the US could almost indefinitely run current account and fiscal deficits and always find somebody that is willing to finance this deficit. This is still true today. So this is the context by which all these flurry reports started a few days ago.
Yeah, I mean, it really sounds like something out of a movie, right? Formal deals, secret deals, military assistance, and sort of oil money. Most of these press reports are suggesting that it was the first of these two sort of agreements, but you might suspect that it is possibly the second, the one that's remained secret for decades. Could you sort of help us unpack this a bit? And is there a difference if it's a formal agreement or as opposed to just an established practice?
Yeah, so, and this is the key point. So, between the two agreements, the one that was signed on the 8th of June 74 is the one that everybody's pointing at. You see, they haven't renewed um, this 50th anniversary and so on is expired. But first of all, read the report and the agreement. It says it's a 5-year agreement that gets renewed unless and until one of the two sides writes a letter to the other side 6 months in advance to say, I don't want to renew it. So it has been quietly renewed across time, and it will continue to do so unless and until one of the sides does write a letter. The other one that has been secret for decades is the one in which the US says, okay, Saudi, I will provide all the military equipment you need, but you, in return, you will need to reinvest your petrodollars into the US Treasury market. And this is effectively what happened. But let's assume for a moment that that secret deal, to some extent, did not exist. Would something dramatically have changed? Well, not really, because think about the following. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution began. And while for many decades, and this would require perhaps an ad hoc podcast, Iran was the closest ally of the US in the region. After the Iranian Revolution, that was not possible. And therefore, the US did need to side with Saudi Arabia no matter what. I don't need to remind everybody that Saudi and Iran are two polar opposite sides in the Middle East. Now, so the US would have supported militarily Saudi Arabia no matter what. If anything, just to contain Iran. And in terms of the recycling of petrodollars, where else could the Saudis go? Really, you need a very large, very liquid, sophisticated enough market in which to pour these billions and billions and billions of revenues every year without, of course, posing all sorts of financial instability episodes. And so the only market out there was the one provided by the US. In fact, this is so true that in the aftermath of the June 74 agreement, the Saudis were still trading oil in pound sterling, which was the currency prevailing at the time. We remember that's kind of the legacy of the gold standard with London at the center. And then somehow, and this is where the secret agreement comes on board, by the end of the year, these transactions in pound sterling stopped and they all became in dollars. So, the practice is so much more relevant than the theory, and therefore also, I would say, of the conspiracy theories behind all this.
Yeah. Um, it sounds like from what you're saying, given that the US is such a central part of all of this and is almost irreplaceable in terms of the amount of money that they can give for Saudi oil, but also as a potential market for treasuries investment, that effectively the US role in this is too big to fail. But that might potentially be challenged by this sort of other element, and I think this, furthers the movie plot, which is there's now a CBDC element, right? Central bank digital currencies have taken the world by storm over the last few years, and Saudi Arabia has recently inked a new deal confirming it's joining the Enbridge multi CBDC project. I mean, what is this project? What does this mean? And does this actually, I mean, is this a sort of routine agreement, or does this signal something more pivotal about his sort of shift away from the Western financial architecture?
Yes, I mean, you're right. It does look like a movie, and there are some elements of it. But the fact that we are indeed experiencing a shift in the global financial order and more in general in the global geopolitical order, and the two things tend to coincide. Now, let's unpack all these items that you suggested. So, a number of countries are exploring CBDCs. There are central bank digital currencies. These are like our notes and coins that will assume a digital form because in the digital era, everything needs to become digital. Now, it seems like just a tech adjustment, but it's not. It has huge, huge implications that, by the way, we have discussed in some of our articles and will be further discussed in months ahead. But one of the main experiments in all these is this Enbridge project led by the People's Bank of China, which is effectively a cooperation agreement between China and several other central banks, including some in the Middle East, to see whether instantaneous cross-border transactions can be made using this new technology, the CBDCs. Now, the fact that Saudi Arabia decided to join this project may signal that they are ready to start transacting oil in something different than the dollar. A, a discussion that needs to be inserted here, perhaps as a parenthesis, but it explains the whole story, is that some people expect the petrodollar to be substituted at some point by the petro yuan, people call it. So the transaction in oil will happen not in dollar, but in the Chinese renminbi or yuan currency. I don't think this is exactly how things will play out. Yes, there will be more transactions in local currencies, including renminbi, but the convenience of the dollar was just discussed a minute ago, so I don't think this is the key element. The key element is that China is preparing the rails across the world for countries to issue their own CBDCs, which will run on Chinese-led rails. And imagine a railway system in which you own and control the rails, and you can decide which trains run, their speed, the destination. You really control the world. And so the fact that effectively Saudi Arabia has decided to join this experiment, and of course is the early stages, there are many points in time in which Saudi Arabia can say, thank you, I tried, I didn't like, and so on and so forth. Nothing is set in stone, but the signal that they are sending is very strong. And so to conclude, the real story here, the real plot is the petrodollars as we knew it, as we know it today, as we always know it. So, Saudi selling oil in dollars, this dollar go to New York, be recycled in the treasury market, in the equity market, and so on. Is this something that is going to change? Will this transaction happen in a totally different way, with an instantaneous payment happening in a payment system controlled by the Chinese, on which the US had nothing to say? This is the real question. If it is the case, then the role of the dollar as the unchallenged global reserve currency will eventually, may actually come to an end in coming months and years.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds like as much of a Chinese story as it is a Saudi story. And it surprises me that if Saudi can't build the underlying digital infrastructure itself for sort of bigger CBDC projects, then what about sort of other countries that are way behind Saudi in terms of access to capital and sort of overall technological development? They're even more likely to have to adopt or sort of be part of this broader Chinese program, where again its dominance could really change the global financial architecture so significantly. So something really to watch, not just for months, but for years to come. So as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.